This all happened back in the summer of 2015, and I still get chills thinking about it. I had decided to take a solo road trip out to the Cascade Mountain Range, about 4 hours north of Seattle. I'd heard rumors online about this old, abandoned fire lookout tower deep in the Olympic National Forest. Honestly, I was obsessed with the idea of exploring it. The photos I'd seen online were incredible. This weathered wooden structure perched high above the tree line, offering what people described as absolutely breathtaking, 360-degree views of the wilderness below. Now, I should probably mention up front that what I was planning wasn't exactly legal. The Forest Service had posted warnings that the lookout was off-limits to the public. They hadn't maintained it in years, and there were legitimate concerns about structural instability. Climbing up there, let alone camping inside, was technically trespassing. But here's the thing. I'd spent weeks researching this place on hiking forums and adventure blogs, and almost everyone who'd been there said the structure seemed solid enough. The only problem? The most recent post I could find was from 3 years earlier, back in 2012. So realistically, I had absolutely no idea what condition the tower would be in when I finally reached it. I left early on a Saturday morning, my Jeep packed with camping gear and supplies for a 2-day excursion. The drive took me through some beautiful country, past small logging towns, winding mountain roads, and eventually onto increasingly remote Forest Service roads. Finally, I found what I was looking for. A small turnout on the side of a gravel road, almost hidden by overgrown brush. It was just barely wide enough to squeeze my vehicle into without blocking the road completely. Perfect. I grabbed my backpack, which I'd carefully packed with 2 days' worth of food, water, sleeping gear, and emergency supplies, and locked up the Jeep. Then I double-checked my handheld GPS unit. The kind with satellite connectivity that still works even when you're miles beyond cell phone coverage. I punched in the coordinates I'd saved for the fire lookout and started hiking. Here's the thing about getting to places like this: there aren't any official trails. The Forest Service doesn't exactly maintain a nice, marked path to structures they don't want people visiting. So I was basically bushwhacking the entire way, using my GPS to make sure I was heading in the right direction while cutting through dense, untouched wilderness. Fallen logs blocked my path every few hundred yards. Thorny underbrush tore at my pants. The terrain was rough and unforgiving, all steep inclines and rocky slopes. The hike from where I'd parked took somewhere between 4 and 5 hours. Longer than I'd anticipated. And the deeper into the forest I went, the more challenging the terrain became. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more and more sunlight. The ground became increasingly uneven, covered in a thick carpet of moss and rotting vegetation. I was really counting on that fire lookout being intact and stable enough to camp in. Because honestly, I wasn't thrilled about the backup plan of pitching my tent somewhere in this dense, dark forest and sleeping on the ground. After what felt like an eternity of exhausting hiking, constantly checking my GPS and pushing through the woods, I finally caught my first glimpse of it. There it was. The tower, its wooden structure rising above the surrounding trees like some ancient sentinel. As I got closer, my anxiety started to ease a bit. It actually looked like it was in decent shape, all things considered. Sure, the paint had long since weathered away, leaving the wood exposed and gray with age, but the structure itself appeared solid. It wasn't collapsing or leaning or anything like that. I approached cautiously and spent a few minutes inspecting the support beams at the base. I gave them several hard pushes, testing their stability. They were remarkably solid. Barely any give at all. Feeling more confident, I decided to test the ladder. It was made of metal and had definitely seen better days, covered in rust and oxidation, but it felt sturdy under my weight. Each rung creaked and groaned as I climbed, the sound echoing through the quiet forest, but it held firm. When I finally pulled myself up onto the wooden platform at the top, I had to stop and just take it all in. The view was absolutely stunning. Breathtaking in a way that no photograph could ever capture. From up here, I could see the entire forest spreading out in every direction, an endless sea of green treetops rolling away toward the distant mountains. There wasn't a single building, road, or house visible anywhere. No signs of civilization at all. Just pure, untouched wilderness stretching to the horizon. It was exactly the kind of isolation I'd been looking for. After spending several minutes soaking in the incredible panoramic view, I made my way around the narrow walkway that circled the structure and stepped inside the lookout cabin itself. It was surprisingly small. Nothing like those spacious, renovated fire lookouts you see advertised as Airbnb rentals on Instagram. This was just a single room, maybe 150 square feet at most, with low ceilings and windows on all four walls. In one corner sat the rusted metal frame of what had once been a bed, now just a skeletal outline with the mattress long since rotted away. An old wooden desk occupied another corner, its surface warped and water-damaged, with papers and debris scattered around it. The windows were in rough shape, most of the glass either cracked or missing entirely, leaving the frames open to the elements. There really wasn't much else to see inside, so I got to work setting up my sleeping area. I dropped my heavy backpack in the corner with the old bed frame, then rolled out my camping mattress and sleeping bag on the relatively flat wooden floor. The boards creaked under my weight, but they seemed solid enough. Once my sleeping area was ready, I pulled out my portable camping stove and heated up a freeze-dried meal for dinner. It wasn't gourmet by any means, but after hours of hiking, it tasted amazing. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I walked back out onto the wooden deck that wrapped around the cabin. I stood there, leaning against the railing, and watched one of the most spectacular sunsets I'd ever witnessed in my life. The way the light filtered through the distant trees, the way the shadows lengthened across the forests below. It was absolutely magical. The only downside was how quickly it seemed to happen. One moment, the sky was ablaze with color, and the next, darkness was swallowing everything. It was a particularly cloudy night too, which meant no moonlight or stars to illuminate the sky. Just complete, total darkness. But with nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, I stayed sitting out there on the deck for quite a while, enjoying the peaceful solitude and the sounds of the forest at night. I'd been sitting there for probably an hour, maybe more, when I noticed something unusual down below. There was a light moving through the trees, weaving its way through the darkness. At first, I thought it might be another hiker with a flashlight, but as I watched more carefully, I realized something was off about it. This wasn't the steady, white beam of a modern LED flashlight or headlamp. Instead, it had this warm, orangish glow, and it was flickering, moving and dancing in a way that seemed almost alive. It reminded me of firelight, like someone was carrying a torch, or maybe a lantern. This led me to believe that whoever was down there was deliberately using some kind of open flame for light, which struck me as incredibly strange. I mean, who hikes through the wilderness at night with a torch instead of a regular flashlight? It didn't make any practical sense. I watched as the mysterious light continued moving between the trees, weaving back and forth maybe a few hundred yards from where I was perched. The chances of running into another person out here, in such a remote and difficult-to-reach location, seemed astronomically slim. There was no trail to follow, no marked path. You'd have to know exactly where you were going and deliberately make the trek. It seemed like an impossible coincidence that someone else would be out here at the exact same time as me. I kept my eyes fixed on that strange, flickering light as it moved through the forest below. Then, after several minutes, it disappeared behind something. Maybe a large rock formation or a particularly dense cluster of trees. And I lost sight of it completely. I waited, watching the darkness intently, but for the next 30 minutes or so, the light never reappeared. Maybe whoever it was had stopped to make camp, or maybe they'd headed off in a different direction. Either way, they were gone. I stayed out on the deck though, still taking in the profound calmness and quietness of the night. There's something special about being that far from civilization, surrounded by nothing but nature. Eventually, though, the wind started picking up, cutting through my jacket and making it uncomfortably cold. I decided it was probably time to call it a night. I stood up, stretching my stiff legs, and walked to the railing to take one final look at the view before heading inside. That's when I saw them. Someone was standing directly below me, at the base of the tower, in that small clearing between the wooden support legs and the edge of the forest. They were just standing there, completely still. And from what I could tell in the darkness, they appeared to be looking straight up at me. My first thought was that this must be whoever had been carrying that torch I'd seen earlier. Maybe they'd come to check if the lookout was occupied before trying to climb up themselves. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. I didn't know what else to say. But they didn't respond. They didn't move. They just stood there in the darkness, creating this incredibly awkward and unsettling moment. For maybe 10 or 15 seconds, we just looked at each other. Or at least, I looked down at this dark figure while they presumably looked up at me. The silence was deafening. Then, finally, they lifted one hand up in the air. It was almost like a wave, or maybe an acknowledgement of some kind. Or perhaps they were apologizing for disturbing me. I honestly couldn't tell. The gesture was brief and ambiguous. Then, without saying a single word, they turned around and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. And here's the really weird part: they didn't turn on any light. No flashlight, no torch, nothing. They just walked straight into those pitch-black woods like they could see perfectly fine. Obviously, the whole encounter was incredibly creepy and unsettling. But for some reason, in that moment, I managed to rationalize it away. I convinced myself it was just another hiker or backpacker who wanted to stay in the lookout tower for the night. They'd probably been approaching, seen me up here, and realized the spot was already taken. That would explain why they just stood there looking up. They were probably trying to figure out if anyone was actually inside. And maybe they were just shy or didn't want to bother me, which would explain the weird hand gesture and the silent departure. It made sense, right? I stayed outside for a little while longer, watching the spot where the figure had disappeared into the trees, but I didn't see anything else. No more lights, no more mysterious strangers. Finally, I went back inside the cabin, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and tried to warm up. The temperature had really dropped since sunset, and I could feel the cold seeping up through the wooden floor despite my sleeping pad. Falling asleep took longer than usual. The wind kept hitting the broken windows, creating this constant whistling sound. The wooden beams of the structure creaked and groaned beneath me with every gust, making me acutely aware that I was sleeping in an old, abandoned building suspended high above the ground on what were probably aging support posts. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I have no idea how much time passed. Whether it was 1 hour or 3 or 5. But at some point deep in the night, I woke up suddenly. The wind had died down completely, and it was still pitch black outside. I opened my eyes, lying there in my sleeping bag, confused about what had pulled me out of sleep. Had I been dreaming? Was it just a random awakening? Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. The soft, metallic creak of the ladder outside. I sat up instantly, my heart already starting to pound. I held my breath, listening intently, telling myself I must be mistaken. Maybe it was just the wind making the metal expand or contract. Maybe it was just the structure settling. But then I heard it again. And again. Each creak was distinct, rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was climbing up the ladder. I couldn't tell how far up they'd already climbed. I couldn't see them through the windows. It was too dark outside, and the interior of the cabin was completely black. But I could hear the hinges at the top of the ladder, where it connected to the platform, creaking with every single step they took. Someone was definitely climbing toward me. I quickly unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could and got to my feet, my heart absolutely racing in my chest. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my backpack. Thank God I'd kept it right next to me. And I carefully, slowly made my way toward the door that led out to the exterior walkway. Every step I took made the floorboards creak, and I winced, terrified that whoever was climbing the ladder would hear me moving around inside. During the 20 seconds or so that it took me to cross the small cabin and reach the door, the creaking sounds from the ladder got progressively louder and faster. Whoever was climbing was speeding up, like they knew I was awake and they were trying to reach the top quickly. Then, Just as I pushed open the door and stepped out onto the narrow wooden platform, the creaking suddenly stopped completely. I stood there frozen in place, my hand still on the door handle, waiting for any sound. My breathing seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Slowly, carefully, I started making my way around the walkway that circled the cabin. The wood beneath my feet creaked with every step, and I had to grip the railing tightly because my legs were shaking so badly. I crept along until I reached the corner of the structure where I'd have a view of the ladder entrance. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a deep breath and peered around the corner, expecting to see someone's head and shoulders coming up over the edge of the platform. But there was nobody there. The top of the ladder was empty. I stood there for a moment, completely confused and terrified, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Or rather, what I wasn't seeing. Very carefully, hardly breathing, I walked closer to the ladder opening. I could feel my heart rate accelerating with every step, that primal fight or flight response flooding my system with adrenaline. When I reached the edge, I leaned over the railing and looked down. Nobody was on the ladder. Not at the top, not in the middle, not at the bottom. The entire thing was empty. I was in total shock, frozen there, trying to understand what the hell was happening. I knew I'd heard those sounds. I knew someone had been climbing that ladder. But there was nobody here. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. That's when I heard the footsteps. A sudden sequence of rapid footsteps came rushing around the wooden walkway behind me. Heavy boots on wood, running fast, coming straight toward me. I spun around just in time to catch a glimpse of a dark figure sprinting along the platform on the opposite side of the cabin. They were moving between the broken windows, and in the brief moment I saw them, they looked like nothing more than a black silhouette against the slightly less dark sky. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. Pure instinct took over. I immediately lowered myself onto the ladder and started climbing down as fast as I possibly could. It was absolutely terrifying. My hands were slipping on the cold, damp metal rungs. My whole body was shaking violently from the massive adrenaline rush coursing through me. The ladder felt impossibly slippery, and I was acutely aware that one wrong move, one slip, and I could fall a good 25 or 30 feet to the hard ground below. And all the while, I knew that whoever, or whatever, had been up there with me was right behind me. I'd made it maybe halfway down when I couldn't help myself. I looked up. And there, leaning over the platform railing, staring down at me, was a head. Just a dark shape, barely visible in the blackness, but I could feel them watching me descend. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. My feet found each rung automatically as I scrambled down that ladder faster than I'd climbed anything in my life. The metal creaked and groaned under my frantic movements, but I didn't care if the whole thing collapsed at that point. I just needed to get down and get away. The moment my feet hit solid ground, I ran. I sprinted straight into the forest, not even bothering with the GPS at first, just putting as much distance as possible between myself and that tower. Branches whipped across my face and tore at my clothes. I couldn't see where I was going, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness, but I didn't care. I just ran. After maybe 50 yards or so, I finally slowed down enough to yank my backpack around and dig out my flashlight. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, but I finally got it turned on. That beam of light cutting through the darkness was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I pulled out my GPS unit next and tried to steady my breathing enough to read the screen. I still don't know why I'd grabbed my backpack when I first woke up and heard those sounds on the ladder. It was just pure instinct, I guess. But it was the single best decision I ever made. It might have even saved my life. With my flashlight and GPS, I was actually able to navigate my way out of there, to find my way back to the road and my Jeep. The hike back took hours. I was practically jogging the entire way, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. Every snapping branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made my heart stop. But as far as I could tell, I wasn't being followed. Nothing came crashing through the woods behind me. I never saw that flickering torchlight again. When I finally made it back to where I'd parked, the sun was just starting to come up, painting the sky that same orange and pink I'd watched from the tower the evening before. But this time, I didn't stop to admire it. I threw my backpack in the Jeep, started the engine, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight through, didn't stop for anything, didn't look back. To this day, I have no idea who or what was in that forest with me. Was it the same person I'd seen standing below the tower earlier? Were they trying to scare me? Were they trying to hurt me? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that I've never gone back to that fire lookout. I've never even driven on that Forest Service road again. And whenever I see photos online of abandoned places in the woods, beautiful and remote and beckoning to be explored, I remember that night. I remember the sound of footsteps on that walkway. I remember that dark figure leaning over the railing, watching me climb down into the darkness. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some places should stay that way.